this photograph I put up here. I took it when I was going up the River Dart down in Devon, and the reason why I took it was you can see a distinct line in the water and then in the tree foliage, and it shows you a really good example of the impact of the tide on the riverbank and how the trees have adapted to surviving with this continual movement of water going in, out, up and down. And at that very clear line where at high water, you can just see that the trees and the branches have stopped growing. But it was amazing, just all the way up the river, you could see this divide line, which is, it's pretty spectacular. So that's why I put that picture up. So tonight's session is about tides. For those of you who have never sailed before, you will find that unless you're sailing on a pond or a lake, the tides will partially dictate your decision-making process when it comes to sailing. And it's in both parts of the syllabus of the level 1 and the level 2. So this session is really going to cover what is the tide, what causes the tide, the effect of the tide, how you should use the tide, and then sources of tidal information. So that's what tonight's session is going to be about. But feel free to ask questions as we go through if there's anything you don't understand or want further sort of discussion on. So what is the tide? So at its very basic, the tide is the gravitational movement of water that gives us high and low water. If you've been to Erith, then you know the long slipway with the red pillar at the end of it, the navigation mark. That is a really good indication of how high and how low the water is or can be. It shouldn't be confused with currents, which are caused by a mix of water temperature, saltiness, the Coriolis effect, wind, and so on. So if you're in the South Atlantic where there's no land, the currents there are whipped up by wind, by water temperature, and that's why you get these massive waves and this circular motion of water. So there's a lot of that is driven by currents rather than by tide. It's more noticeable in some areas of the world than in others, and geography has an impact as well. So for instance, the tidal range at Erith is between 5 and 7 meters. However, if you're in the Severn Estuary sailing up towards Bristol, it can actually be somewhere between 12 and 14 meters. It's the second highest tidal range in the world in the Severn Estuary and Bristol Channel, which is why you get the phrase ship shape in Bristol fashion, because you needed to make sure that everything was neatly put away and the ship was properly tied up, otherwise it would fall over when within that tidal range. Geography, if any of you have been down at the Solent, you find that Southampton has 2 high waters, one straight after the other. So the tide comes in, drops a little bit, and then comes back in again before you then go out to low tide. So, and that's because of the Isle of Wight and the way the water flows around both sides of the island that you get that. So the tide does lots of peculiar things. It's affected by lots of different aspects, including, in fact, by weather, by high pressure and low pressure. So so that's it at a very basic level.
Jeremy,
Yeah.
question if I may. As you get closer to the equator, do tidal ranges tend to increase or decrease?
That is a very good question that I do not know the answer to. John, do you know the answer?
Yeah, I'll try. If you think about the fact that the tide is effectively a bulge on either side of the planet, you expect that to increase close to the equator, but the astronomical tide volume is actually not that high. And the reason the tidal range is so high here is mainly caused by geography. I think in the middle of an ocean, the tidal range might only be about half a meter or something. I could be wrong. Yeah, I would expect the further away you go from the equator, the less tide you get. However, the high tidal range here is caused by geography.
I can't remember where the highest tidal range is. It might be France. I know that if you go to a place like St. Malo, at high water, you see all these marker buoys and you navigate your way in. Then at low water, you can walk out to those marker buoys because they're completely dried out.
May I just ask a question, Jeremy and John?
Yeah.
When John's using the phrase because of geography, what exactly do you have in mind when you say because of geography?
What we mean is where the land is and how it's shaped. So you've got things like the Isle of Wight is a good example of a small island that has an impact on how water flows and therefore has an impact on how the tide it operates. And when you do long distance navigating, even down the south coast, you have what are called tidal nodes. It's a little bit complicated, this, but tidal nodes where basically and you have to use these tidal nodes to get down the coastline, and the geography dictates that. So for places like Portland Bill, because it pokes out, you go further down the coast to Land's End. There's another one. You know, these are all points on England that have an impact on how the tide works, and that's where your planning comes in. You always want to know where they're going to be, what they're going to be.
So just to clarify, in the case of the Severn Estuary, which you mentioned has this very high, second highest normal tidal range, I'd guess just from hearing you guys start talking about this, is that because, say, the estuary shape almost funnels and magnifies the effect of the incoming tide? Is that the kind of idea there, or?
Yeah, and also you're coming straight off the Atlantic as well, and it's coming up the Irish Sea and then going into the Bristol Channel. So and that's and that's why you get these massive ranges, whereas somewhere up on the east coast, I think it was Waldringfield when I was on holiday up there, their tidal range is about 3 meters. It's peanuts. We'd be laughing if that was at Erith. Instead of on a spring tide, you get 7 meter tidal ranges. So your same volume of water for your 5 meter tidal range, as it were, is being pushed up at the you're getting greater volume of water being pushed up at the same time frame as your 5 meter volume of water. So it has to move faster.
That's lovely. Thank you.
So what causes the tide? So again, at its very basic, and John will add in a sprinkling of science, the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun are what cause the tide. And when they're acting together, you get spring tide. So you'll hear sailors talk about springs and neaps. So spring tide is when you have the biggest tidal range between low water and high water. And then when the sun and the moon are acting against each other in terms of gravitational pull, you've then got neap tides, which is the smallest water range between low water and high water. And when I show you the tidal predictions, you'll sort of see what I mean. So John and I had a chat last night, and the next lot of spring tides, the tidal range is 7 meters for spring tides. The next neaps, I think it's 5.6 meter tidal range. So there can be fairly big differences between what you'll get on a neap tide and what you'll get on a spring tide. And you can generally tell whether it's springs or neaps because you're either looking at a half moon for your neap tides, or you're looking at a full moon or no moon if it's a spring tide. And the other thing to remember is that if you see a full moon or no moon, if you can not see a moon, if you see what I mean, that actually the effect of that on the tide is usually a day later. So there's a little bit of a time lag between the position of the moon and the sun, and then the tide actually being the highest or the lowest. So there's usually about a day time lag. John, do you want to interrupt?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So Jeremy's explanation about spring and neap tides is correct. But what's not here is the fact we've got 2 tides a day. The reason is, so we've, rather than just 1 high tide a day, the reason we've got 2 is it's actually, it's not just the fact the moon is pulling the water towards the moon is pulling everything towards the moon. But the further you go away from the moon, the weaker the effect of the moon's gravity is. So the water on the side facing the moon is pulled towards the moon more than the Earth as a solid body. And the water on the other side is pulled towards the moon less than the Earth itself. So it's allowed to kind of like the Earth is pulled away from it almost. So that's why you've got 2 bulges a day. One bulge on the same side as the moon and 1 bulge on the opposite side of the moon. But the effect of the sun either reinforces it if it's aligned to the moon or opposite to the moon, or it has basically no effect if it's at right angles to the moon when you get neap tides.
So happily, as we only ever can sail on one side of the Earth, you only ever need to worry about 1 bulge rather than both. So
Hold on, no, you have to worry about both of them.
I don't worry about both of them.
That just gives you tide every 12 hours.
Again, when it comes to, if you do a level 3 course and you do passage planning, then your tides they start to dictate when you leave, when you arrive, where you need to be at a particular time, far more than us just pottering around off the yacht club, because you're now working within tide cycles rather than just on a single tide like we normally sail at Erith. So we go down to Greenhithe, which we're hoping to do later on in June. We will play with the tides for that. So we will go down with the tide, be at the pub until just after low water, and the tide turns and comes back in again, and then we'll sail back up to the yacht club because it's more efficient to sail with the tide than against it, which I'll get to later. So there's roughly 6 hours between your high water and low water. Now I say roughly because it's not quite. So actually you'll find that the time of high and low water changes, and that's where
notification about it.
And that's why we get our sailing changes. So one weekend we might sail in the morning, but the next weekend we might sail in the afternoon, and that's that small slippage per day of when high and low water is. So while it's roughly 6 hours, it's not absolute. But again, if you're sailing locally, you only really need to worry about the fact that it's roughly 6 hours. You don't need to, you don't need to worry that the next tide might be 5 minutes later or half an hour later, and in some cases it can be an hour difference, depending on where you are. And that the cycle of this spring and neap tide comes from the moon orbiting the Earth over a 28-day period. Again, it's a 28-day period. We tend to work in calendar months of roughly 30 days. So you end up with this out of synchronization in terms of dates and tides. But that's why, again, we have things called tidal prediction atlases and almanacs, which I'll come to at the end, which help guide us through these subtle differences. So the effect of the tide. So the movement of water coming in is known as flooding, and the movement of water out is known as ebbing. And as the water coming in is flooding, the tide goes up, or comes in and goes up. and then when it's ebbing, the water goes down. So it's fairly easy, hopefully, to remember that tide coming in goes up, tide going out goes down. Yeah. And it has an impact on what we do as sailors. At its very basic level, the tide can act as a travelator, hence the diagram from the RYA handbook at the bottom. So if you want to go faster and you want to go and it's going in the direction you want to go, you should always try to go in the tide if it's safe to do so, because you'll get there quicker. So if you've got 4 knots of tide going in the direction you want to go and you're in a boat that only does 3 knots, then between your 3 knots and its 4 knots, you'll go faster. If you turn around and go in the opposite direction and you're doing 3 knots and the boat's doing 4 knots, or sorry, the tide's doing 4 knots, you're going to go backwards. So that's why we always look at what the tide is doing and then what we want to do, and we plan accordingly. So if you go with the tide, you'll go faster. If you go against it, you'll go slower. And if you go sideways onto the tide, you will go sideways. And if you remember our discussion earlier sessions about the centerboard or the keel on a yacht, that centerboard and keel helps to reduce the impact of a sideways slip. We always talk about it for the wind, but actually it's equally applicable for the tide as well. And the way to discover that is when you go sailing in a boat that has a centerboard or a daggerboard, if you lift it up and then sail, you'll find you'll go rapidly sideways, and that won't just be caused by the wind. So the tide can also be your friend, and it's worth seeing the tide as something that can facilitate what you do. So if you need to slow down, then you know that you would turn into the tide in order to slow down. So that slowing down might be because you want to come alongside something or to pick up a mooring buoy. You might want to pick up one of your crew who's fallen over the side. We use it all the time. In fact, when I'm in a safety boat, I rarely put the engine into reverse because I tend to use the tide as my brake rather than reverse. So that does lead us on to using the tide. Why bother? So if we know what the tide is doing before we go sailing, we can help keep ourselves safe. And when we're on the water, we can sail the most efficient course or whatever it is that we're doing. So if we know its direction of travel, as I mentioned before, it helps you when it comes to slowing down to pick up moorings, or you can speed up. Or if you're going to Greenhithe, you don't want to go down to Greenhithe on an incoming tide where it's going to slow you down and make it a longer trip to get to the pub for a drink. So you'd want to go with an outgoing tide because it'll be quicker for you to get to where you want to have your drink and lunch, and the same for coming back. So knowing the direction of travel is really useful, and it just means that you work with nature rather than against it. Knowing when high water or low water is also important. Not only does that then tell you when you should go sailing, but again, if you're anchoring somewhere, you don't want to anchor in the shallows on an outgoing tide and then find that you've run aground for the next 4 hours and you've got to wait for the tide to come back in, as I believe at least one person in this group experienced running aground last year when his skipper wasn't paying attention. So again, outgoing tides and anchoring are always a little bit nerve-wracking because someone's got to make the calculation and get it right as to how much water will be below the keel. At least in a dinghy, you can lift the centerboard up. And again, if you know when low water is and high water is, that helps with the planning of where you're going to go. So let's say we wanted to go for lunch down at Greenhithe and we wanted to be there for 12:30. You would look for a low tide that is somewhere around 12:30, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so that you're down there in good time. There'll be a bit more tide going out, and then the tide turns, and you know that at 1:30 the tide has turned, it's going back in. You've got 6 hours to get back to the yacht club. It's only going to take you 3, so you've got a margin of error. So that's why knowing when high and low water is is really important. And also knowing if it's springs or neaps, because that will give you an indication of how fast the water will be traveling. You know, if it's spring tides, the water will travel faster. If it's neap tides, it will be slower. And also you won't have as high water but on a neaps, and you won't have as low water on neaps as you would on the springs. So all this information helps us build up a picture of where we're going to go sailing. And it helps us understand about speeding up, slowing down, where to be in the river to best advantage if you're racing. It supports what we do in terms of maneuvers like coming alongside, anchoring and mooring. So the tide will always be there looking over your shoulder, ready to punish you when you make the wrong decision. So tide can be king at Erith. When we're racing, we can lay out a beautiful triangular course that has upwind, downwind, across the wind. But actually you'll find that because of the tide, a lot of the time we actually physically will sail a different course, because that brings us back to our 5 essentials of, course made good, sailing the best course. And you'll only really sort of understand all of that when you've gone out and done it. So when you want to go sailing, my advice to you guys is the first thing you do is look at the weather, see what it's like. Is it appropriate? Can you cope with the conditions? The second thing you do is you look at the tides, and then you work out whether the tides are appropriate for what it is you want to do. We tend to sail on an incoming tide at Erith because the incoming tide is slightly slower than the outgoing tide. And we also have a peculiarity due to the shape of the river in what's called a back eddy. So while the tide's coming in and it hits the shore at Erith, it splits in two, carries on up into London like the normal tide does. But then we get a back eddy of water coming back past the yacht club in the opposite direction, like a whirlpool effect. And that gives you that safety margin that if you get it into trouble, you can sort of get yourself back into the conveyor belt and end up back at the yacht club and then self-rescue if necessary. And the reason why the water flows out faster is that you've got the natural flow of the River Thames coming down that then meets the outgoing tide, and the two of them together just push a greater volume of water out, whereas you've got the Thames, the tide coming in and the Thames water naturally flowing down, and it does slow the water down a bit. So the next thing is, how do we find all of that information out? Luckily, you'll find a lot of places will provide tide tables. Tide tables are pretty basic, though there are a few pitfalls that you need to be aware of. So the first thing is to look for the published timetables. They'll either be online, like the link I've put for the PLA. That's the one I use within Almanacs. So for those people who own yachts, you can buy for a large amount of money Reed's Almanac, which gives you the main tides for the main ports of the UK. And the book's about, well, it's probably about yay thick. It's quite a substantial publication. And also you can get them online. If you're sailing in Chichester Harbour, for argument's sake, they have their own tidal almanacs online, which I used when I sailed down there. So you'll find that they are specific to an area because every area has a slightly different tidal time than the next one, even if it's a next door port. So the one I've done a screenshot of here is of London Bridge for this month, and it's Greenwich Mean Time. So what are we? We are the 8th of April. So in the second column, you can see 8th, Thursday. You've got a time column and you've got a meters column. So the time column is always done in 24-hour, and the meter column is always done to 1 decimal place. The lowest number is your low water, and it's taken from what's called chart datum, which is the calculated astronomically low water that you would expect. So what this is saying is that at 5:24 GMT at London Bridge, the water is predicted to be 1.1 meter above that lowest chart datum low water, and that high water will be 6.5 meters above that. So the tidal range there is, what's that, 5.4 meters. So we know that we're on NEAPS at the moment because that's pretty low. So this is effectively what they look like, and I'll take you more closely through how we use them. But you can see on the very left-hand side, because the Port of London Authority covers quite a large area, you could choose the tide times for Margate, Southend, Corriton, wherever that is, Tilbury, North Woolwich, London Bridge, Chelsea, Richmond, Shivering Sands, which is down in the estuary, and Walton on the Naze. So you can choose the one that's relevant to where you are planning to be sailing. So I always choose London Bridge for the very simple reason that Erith is half an hour before London Bridge. So it's very easy to correct the time. So here we go. So you've got your high water and your low water times on the left, your high water and low water meters on the right. You'll also have it indicate whether it's full moon. So you've got your springs, and that's usually by either a black blob or just an unfilled circle, i.e. indicating that it's a new moon. So you know that they're telling you when the spring tides are likely to be because of the full or new moon. And then you can see the NEAPS is the half moon. So it's half black, half white, and then the next one would be half white, half black to indicate the change in phase. And you can see between these two, so on the 12th of April, you can see that the tidal range there is, what's that, 6.4 meters for the spring tide. And then you've got on the NEAPS, you've got actually, what's that, 5.2 meters. So it's actually, that's not a great high spring tide. Really high spring tides at Erith can be over 7 meters. And that usually means it's difficult to launch your boats off the bottom of the slipway because the water's gone so far out, it's left the slipway high and dry, which it can do on occasions. If you were on the day really keen to know what the impact of the high pressure or low pressure of the atmosphere impact is on the tides, you can call up London VTS and they will give you what the actual tidal ranges are for that day. So these are predictions that are done quite a long time in advance. You can get these, up to 4 years in advance. So if you wanted to know on the day, if you're going on a long passage on your yacht, you could call up London VTS and ask them for the actual tidal ranges for that day, and they will then give that to you. That just helps you not run aground.
Jeremy, question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously lots of different sources of tide times, and you've shown us the PLA website. There are lots of others. In terms of accuracy, both the timing and the range, is there a sort of, do they tend to vary or are they pretty much the same?
They can vary because I think they use different algorithms in order to come up with the answer of what they think the tidal predictions are going to be. If you go on to somewhere like Windfinder, you'll find that their tidal times are different to the PLA because they use, I think, a slightly different algorithm to come up with the answers. But usually they're going to be within 10-20 minutes of each other, and in the grand scheme of things, for the sort of sailing that we do, that's not a huge problem.
Sure.
You're more likely to be delayed by your crew or by lunch or the fact that there's not quite enough wind for you to sail at the speed you need to in order to get to where you need to be for the tide to turn, than you are about the slight variation of the tidal predictions.
Thank you.
I agree with Jeremy. It can't be an exact science just because it's affected by things like the winds and the temperature, the pressure. But in terms of how they've actually made these predictions, they've collected maybe 100 years of data, let's say, about one particular place, and they've fitted tidal coefficients to it based on the movement of the moon and the sun. It's essentially, it's like how accurate can these coefficients be? Even if they're perfect, they're still going to be affected by other factors. So you might expect it to be. I mean, I don't really know, but I would expect you might find that the real high water might be as much as 20 minutes out in practice, or maybe a couple of tens of centimeters. What would you say, Jeremy?
No, I agree. And you will also find that when you get to the equinox, you can get very different tidal ranges. So we tend to get the highest tides at Erith during the February equinoxes, and that's when the club floods, which is why it's always worth tying everything down. And that's always happened in my time at the club. So, and also if you have a low pressure system above you, the water level will go higher still because you don't have that weight of atmospheric pressure pushing down on the water. And if you then have an easterly, so if you've got an easterly, spring tides and low pressure, you've got all that water funneling up the Thames that, of course, they can't predict the wind and the atmospheric pressure when they do these. So that's why, was it in the 50s that they had the massive floods up the Thames and up the East Coast?
Yeah.
And that was just that sort of perfect storm of nature that created that situation. So yeah, it's as accurate as I think it can be when you're looking into a crystal ball.
We've got another factor that we haven't even mentioned actually, that pretty much only affects our part of the river.
What's that, the barrier?
Yeah, the barrier. Yeah, that's a huge effect on the tides.
It does indeed. So if any of you have ever sailed at Erith when the barrier is shut, it does the most bizarre things to the tide. So I went out racing years ago and found that there was no tide, and that what really happened was that the tide effectively was shunted to the Essex shore side in a very small band, and the water had basically gone up to the barrier and was beginning to circulate back down again in a swirling effect within the various reaches and rands. It was the most bizarre experience. But again, that will have with the barrier shut, and they tend to shut it at low water, means that the water backs up and then has to flood somewhere. And Erith Yacht Club is on the wrong side of the floodplain, hence the clubhouse being built on stilts. So yeah, John's right. If you know that the barrier is going to be shut, it will have an impact on the water, and also to some extent on where you sail and how you sail. But usually, if the barrier is shut, it's because the weather's pretty terrible. So, or they're doing maintenance. So sometimes they do maintenance every year. I think it's in October, and they'll shut the barrier. But there is always a notice to mariners that goes out from the PLA that will tell you when the barrier is shut, though sometimes it'd be hard to find. So when you're going to choose the correct tidal information, there are a few things that you need to remember. So the first thing you need to remember is the tidal information you're looking at relevant to where you're going to sail from and where you're going to sail to. So if you're going to sail from Southampton to Dartmouth, you not only need to look at the tides for leaving Southampton, but you need to look at the tides for arriving in Dartmouth, as well as working out how fast you're going to go and roughly what time you're going to get there. So so you'll be looking at 2 different tide tables at least to do a passage plan like that. I'm not going to talk to you about primary ports and secondary ports as such, but at a very basic level for us, London Bridge is our primary port. So that is the primary set of tide times that we use at Erith. So Erith is a secondary port because there's no real tide tables ever created for it, but we know that Erith is roughly 30 minutes before London Bridge, whether it's high water or low water. So we are effectively a secondary port, and you'll find in almanacs that's how they operate. They'll give you the primary ports like Southampton, Portsmouth, but then they'll give you the time difference between high water and low water for somewhere like, I don't know, let's say Chichester, Shoreham, or whatever it might be. So you just need to be aware of the difference if you're looking at a primary port tidal timetable to whether there is a difference between where you actually are and the place you're looking at. So for us at Erith, I look at London Bridge, but actually I know I need to either add half an hour or subtract half an hour, depending whether it's GMT or BST, which actually moves on to the next point. You can be really easily caught out when it comes to working out your tide times if you haven't checked whether what you're looking at is GMT or BST. So British summertime, of course, has already started. So if you're looking at tide times between now and the end of October, you need to add an hour to your tide times. Or if it's GMT, then that is what they will show. So it's always GMT as the tide times. However, if I just go back to the PLA one, if you look at the PLA snapshot, you've got time zone GMT. If you click on that on their website, you can actually change that to BST. So it'll do the calculation for you. I tend not to because I then get confused because I've got a very small brain. The other thing, of course, to remember is whether you've got the right date, the right month, and the right year. Because sometimes you'll find that these tide tables can hang around for years, and you might pick one up in a hurry without realizing that actually you've got the wrong year. So it's always worth just checking before you start that you've got the right one, then checking that you've got the right, whether you're in BST or GMT, and then looking at whether the tide table you're actually looking at is a primary port and you need to make adjustments for where you are, or whether it is, you know, where you need to be. If you're in, let's say, Portsmouth or Southampton, you can easily just look at that without having to make any adjustments. So anyway, any questions? I'm happy to go back to anything, as there's quite a lot of information there on tides and things.
Yeah, can I just make 2 points?
Yes.
First is that the tide is a lot weaker at the beginning when it's going from low tide. For the first 2 hours, I think it puts through 1/6 of the water, and then in the middle 2 and more and more. It's much faster in the middle. That's the first point.
That is, so just quickly on that one, Patrick,
Yep.
the others, that's called the rule of 12ths.
Yeah,
So the tide is divided up into the 12 hours of the 6 hours coming in and the 6 hours going out. I haven't touched on that mainly because I think it is a level 3 topic rather than level 2 topic. I may be wrong on that, but Patrick is absolutely right that the tide is slower in the first 2 hours and slower in the last 2 hours and fastest in the middle 2 hours. So you get an exponential curve. I might have a diagram. So Patrick, if you want to carry on, I shall try to find the diagram.
I've got another point as well, and that is that if you're sailing out of Erith and you want to know the tides, if you enter Erith tides into Google, it'll give you the tides for the next 7 days, and it gives it to you in British summertime at the moment, and it gives it for Erith, so you don't have to make the calculation, you know, the -30 for London Bridge. So it's well worth trying, and I think it's pretty accurate. It's actually BBC, and I think it's kind of related to the weather because they give the weather as well. So they've got the data on Erith being 30 minutes or 33 minutes ahead of London Bridge, presumably. Okay.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. I do have a diagram. I don't know how easily I can. So this diagram is a tidal diagram that gives you the low water to high water back to low water, and it's divided up into 12ths. So if you're interested in learning more about that, if you type in rule of 12ths tides into Google, I suspect it will come up with something of use, and then you can learn the next stage of the tides. Now you'd use that a lot if you were going to be doing something like anchoring, because you'd want to know tidal heights. So that's why you'd look at that. But yeah, I think it's a level 3 thing. But Patrick's absolutely right that it does exist as an aid memoir as well.
And you do it in passage planning as well when you're doing your day skipper.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Though I have to say that I rarely, if ever, use the rule of 12ths when I'm doing my passage.
But you do your tidal curve.
No, I don't worry about things like that.
Your bell curve.
I might look at the tidal diamonds, but I wouldn't do that. So, John, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Not really. I mean, even when you're sailing next to the clubhouse, if you think about, well, the rule of 12ths, like as a rough way of kind of having an idea of how fast you expect the water to be flowing. There's, yeah, nothing to add.
But my advice to you about tides is make the tide your friend, not your enemy. Work with it, don't work against it. You'll hear some of us talk about the tide is king, and that's not always true, but it is quite a lot of the time true, especially where we are on the Thames. But it can catch you out, so just be aware of it. And the other thing, of course, is that as you get to know the river, you'll find it's the peculiarities of the shape of the river and the impact that has on the tide. As I've mentioned, the eddy at the yacht club, there are other tidal quirks on other bits of the river that it's worth sort of knowing about, and it does help you when it comes to planning, and it helps you if you in the back of your head you need an escape plan for something that you know you can get into a back eddy that will take you back to the yacht club or whatever it is. So you use it to your advantage, but you will find a lot of what we do at the yacht club is done on an incoming tide or at the very end of an outgoing tide. So tomorrow is a good example that I took a gamble that it's neaps, and that so it's a minimal tidal range, and that it's the last hour of an outgoing tide, so it'll be relatively slow, just so that people could get on the water and do some sailing before the weekend.
Oh yeah, I've got some things to add. So yeah, if you're near the club in a dinghy and the tide is not your friend, and let's imagine there's no eddy, or you don't know where the eddies are somewhere, it's best to stick to the outside of the river. If you're either side, the tide's going to be weakest, and if you're on the inside of the bend, it's weaker. The tide likes to stick to the outside of the bend where it can. And in terms of planning yacht trips, they live by the tide. They almost never ever sail against the tide. Like they'll leave at high water to go down the river, and like they'll go as far as they can in one tide and try and get somewhere and just wait during the incoming tide because it's so strong. I mean, it's like you can easily be back.
Yeah, and actually, you can go out and test it. You know, with two of you out there, one of you can sail slap bang in the fastest bit of the tide, and the other one can sail up the on the shore side where it's shallower, so there's less water, there's less tide, and you'll really see a difference, especially when you're racing. You see a big difference of where you are, and it's really interesting. Having sailed here for quite a long time, you watch people make the same mistakes not everyone, I hasten to add. There are some really irritatingly bright people like John who picks it up very quickly and never forgets. But other people who've sailed there, they'll always make the same mistake of going straight out into the tide because they want to get to the race mark, and they think the shortest distance, physical distance, is the quickest way of getting to the mark, when actually it's not, because they go out into the conveyor belt or the travelator that I showed you, and now they've got the tide against them, rather than working, or faster tide against them, rather than working up through the shallower water where the tide is slower. So you're actually sailing faster, and then your gamble is when you cross the river to get across to the other side. It's a real, you almost stop racing other people to make that decision, because it's a very personal decision, that gamble of when you cross the tide up to the other side. And if you're the second boat, it's brilliant, because the first boat might cock it up and you go, well, I'm not going when he went. So you sail a bit further down the river or up the river, and then you cross the river. And so you've actually made a better decision. But the first, the boat in the lead has got to make a decision at some point. So yeah, it's a real, it adds a sort of third dimension to sailing, and I find it really fascinating.
Jeremy, this is a little gadget that I've seen that I'm quite interested in acquiring. If you see on this side, that is a 12-hour. There you have your moon phases, and this is your tide. So at the top is high tide and low tide at the bottom. And it runs on 3 little quartz clock movements. The moon phase 1 operates on a 28-day cycle for 1 rotation, and then the high tide indicator is geared on 12 hours and 25 minutes per revolution. So I thought to myself, going out sailing, A, I'd like to know what time it is at a glance, and B, at a glance I can see what the moon phase is and where the tide is likely to be at. And I think it would be useful, even every time I get on board my boat to go sailing, I could adjust the tide one, to wherever the tide is relevant that day, and then go out sailing. And if I need to stay out for an extra hour longer to come back in when the tide's not so strong, back to my mooring, I think that would be beneficial to me. So I saw that, I thought it was really good. It's only about 40 quid, and I think I might be going for it.
Oh, interesting. I've never seen one of those before.
Yeah, it's if you look on eBay or Amazon, it's called a tide and moon clock. Yeah.
You've got to be a little bit careful that it gets it right, or you might have to adjust it every couple of months, because every time the moon goes around the Earth, its orbital period changes, and it's also kind of like eccentric as well. So it's actually non-trivial to be able to make a mechanical gadget that predicts tide times months ahead.
I know, but I think it's worthwhile just to give me an indication as to where things are. And I do appreciate, every few days or any time maybe I might have to adjust a tidal aspect of that clock. And like you say, maybe once a week or whenever, adjust the moon. But I'm very happy to do that. I can get most of that data on Windfinder, or well, certainly for the tides. And Windfinder quite accurately has the time for Erith, which is called Crayfordness.
Oh, Crayford, that's the end of our moorings. Yeah, but that's a tidal prediction point as well.
Okay, well, I have my Windfinder set for Crayfordness, and it seems to be pretty accurate. But I leave my phone below deck in my saloon when I go sailing. And I really, really would appreciate the fact that I've been able to tuck my head in and look through my companionway into the saloon and see even what time it is, where the moon is, and what the tide prediction is. I think it's fantastic. I can't wait to get it.
Don't have such luxuries in a dinghy. Are there any other questions about tides? We again, don't forget we've got some at the moment unassigned sessions coming up. So next week we're going to talk about independent sailing. So that's i.e. sailing without safety boat cover and so on. It's really just covering fairly obvious stuff. But then after that, we've got 2 sessions where at the moment John and I haven't allocated anything because we wanted to leave them open in case you guys wanted to recap on stuff or things that you might have missed because you weren't able to make some sessions. If that is the case, then please just email me and let me know, and John and I will then construct a sort of smorgasbord of random bits of sailing information courtesy of whatever you've chucked at us. But it's also an opportunity for you guys, if someone goes, oh, I can't remember the 5 essentials, then actually one of you can put your hand up so you don't have to hear me bleating on all the time. And you can parade your knowledge that you have hopefully learned, because actually that's a way of reinforcing what you've learned. So don't be shy. Yeah, so there are a couple of sessions coming up. So if there's anything that is missing from your memory, then just feel free to tell us.